It's really great to see such a good turnout on a Wednesday afternoon. It's pretty nice outside. This is the first in the first talk in this semester's Global Environment Speaker Series. That series is sponsored by Arts and Sciences with local support from the Department of Geography and Environment, Environmental Studies, and Global Studies. It's really my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker today. Russell Fielding grew up in Florida, went to school as an undergrad at the University of Florida before going on to getting his master's degree in geography at University of Montana and then a PhD in geography at Louisiana State University. And he's now assistant professor of environmental studies in the Department of Earth and Environmental Systems at Sewanee, the University of the South. Where he teaches some really interesting classes on sustainability and global change, and takes students traveling to Iceland and to New Zealand. We had some really great conversations about the interesting, innovative teaching that he does today. So in his research, he studies has a couple of research lines, including kind of studying food and energy systems and questions about the interactions between human and natural systems. In one of those areas of research, he looks at potentials and barriers to renewable energy development in the Caribbean. And then another major research line of his that he's going to talk about today has to do with investigating the environmental and human health implications of artisanal whaling. So his new book is actually available in the back of the room if you're interested in picking up a copy. I welcome you to do that after the talk. And with that, I'll turn it over to Russell and thank him for coming and sharing his research with us.
Thank you very much, Todd. Very happy to be here. This is my first time to visit the University of Richmond, or Richmond altogether. So I've got to say I've received a very warm welcome here, so thank you for that. I am here to talk with you today about the research that went into this book, and this was the study of whaling, and I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page with what that means. I was talking with an older couple back in Sewanee who are friends of our family, and they said, oh, we know all about this. We went whaling off the coast of Cape Cod when we were on vacation last summer. And I said, you did, really? Because that sounds very illegal. And they said, no. It was a boat, and we saw so many whales, and we got to take photos, and it was really a pleasant experience. So just so that we're all clear as to what the subject of today's talk is, and this will serve as both an orientation and something of a trigger warning, this is a situation in which people are hunting whales and killing them for food. I got involved in this research out of a sense of environmentalism, of sustainability. I was concerned that these whaling operations, one of which was in the far north of Europe, in a small country, a small semi-independent country called the Faroe Islands, and the other is in a Caribbean country called St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I was concerned that these whaling operations were operating largely without regulation, and may have been overtaxing or overexploiting the local whale populations. So I started out with a very altruistic kind of sustainability-minded approach, and learned very quickly, as you will with almost anything that you investigate, that it was much more complex than it seemed on the surface. I want to start with something of a mea culpa, I suppose I would call it, or maybe just a placing of my own biases within this research so that you'll understand where I'm coming from. And it starts with the picture that's on the screen behind me. So this image, I took this picture from aboard a Caribbean whaling boat. I spent about 3 months as a crew member on a Caribbean whaling boat. We would go out 6 days a week. The whalers take Sunday off to go to church. We would whale for an average of about 8 hours a day. We would catch as many whales as possible during that time and haul them back to shore where they would be processed and turned into food. At first, this was just absolutely jarring for me. As a kid from Florida, I had seen plenty of at least dolphins from shore, just going to the beach. Never once had the idea that this was an animal that I would consider killing and eating. But that was my own cultural background. I found myself in a new cultural environment where things were very different, and it took some adjustment for me to get used to. I want to read, and I know that reading sections of a book or maybe is a bit of a non-standard approach for this lecture series, but I hope you'll indulge, and I do this because I feel like I wrote it better than I can say it. So I'll read a paragraph here that places my own participation in this work. You've undoubtedly heard from your professors about the concept of participant observation. This was participant observation with a focus on the participant side. So I'll read just a brief section here on my own participation. In fact, my own hands are not clean. The participatory nature of this field work required that I be present to assist in the process of whaling in both locations. To one who equates whaling with murder, I was an accomplice. To the whalers themselves, I was merely an assistant, at best a semi-inept sharer in the labor, at worst a body in the way. In both field sites, more than once, I traveled uncomfortably back to my lodgings after whaling, dried blood and salt residue staining my skin, the smell of the butchery lingering around me, wafting from my clothes and from my hair. I never personally killed a whale, although at times I wanted to. Not for the macabre experience, like some big game trophy hunter, but instead to put a suffering cetacean out of its misery, when the process of dying, which was coldly measured by my stopwatch during the time to death portion of this research, seemed to drag on forever. After a while, though, that sense of sympathy and that sense of a disconnect with what I had grown up with started to fade. And the job of whaling became a job. It became my daily routine. And I don't know that I'm yet fully comfortable with that. The fact that I became so desensitized to something that was once so shocking to me. But I think that does say something about what happens to a person when they are routinely exposed to something that at first is very troubling to them. So let's talk a little bit about these two whaling operations. We're going to start in the Caribbean. The country where this operation is based is St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It's an independent country made up of the main island, St. Vincent, where over 90% of the population lives, and then the Grenadines, which are a series of smaller islands kind of dribbling off to the south. The animals pictured here represent just a sample of the species that are hunted by Vincentian whalers. These are probably the top 5, although the species composition changes year by year based on what's available. The second animal down, the short-finned pilot whale, is the main target species. This is the one the whalers are going for, if not necessarily the one that they are mostly catching. This is the main island here, St. Vincent, and the village circled, Barrowley, is the village where the whalers depart from. There's only one whaling village in the country. Every whaler in St. Vincent eventually moves to Barrowley to continue being a whaler. And this is what that village looks like. A very typical Eastern Caribbean village on an island that does not have much tourism. So if you've been to the Caribbean as a vacation, you've probably seen settings that look very different to this, with more resorts and white sand beaches. This is what a more working Caribbean village looks like. This is what a Caribbean whaling boat looks like. This is the whole thing. First thing you notice, first attribute of this boat you notice is probably its small size, and the fact that many of those whales that this boat would be going after are actually bigger than the boat itself. That's just the way they do it there. They drag the whales back to shore after having tied them alongside the boat, or if they are small enough, if they're some of those smaller dolphin species that I pictured, they'll actually haul it on board to haul it back to shore inside the boat. I have here a series of images that I'd like to show you of the very first whale, in this case the species was Rizzos Dolphin, that I saw killed. And I don't want you to get too hung up on the whale-dolphin dichotomy. That's actually a much more fluid distinction than you might think. The whole order of Cetacea contains whales and dolphins both, and all of these species that are being hunted are cetaceans. The common names might include whale or dolphin, but that doesn't actually say much about the taxonomy. So this is a Rizzos dolphin. It was the first one that I saw killed. And in preparing the slides for this lecture, I didn't necessarily set out to choose the images of the first one that I saw killed. I just wanted to get the ones that were the best. And it turns out that the first time I saw a whale get killed was also the time that I took the best photos. And I don't think that was by chance. I think I was hiding behind my camera. This was something that I was as prepared for as I could be from reading and from talking with the people that I was going to be working with. But you know as well as I do that there are some things that you can't fully prepare for unless you're in the moment seeing it happen. And this was one of those times. This was pre-iPhone days. I had an actual camera with a screen that you hold away from your face, and I hid behind that camera to take these pictures. And I got some really good shots, although I somewhat insulated myself from this first time. I'm going to show you these images, and at the same time I'll read the description of this whaling event. So I've told you the name of the village is Barely. I should give you a little background. The name of the whaler, the man pictured in this image, is Samuel, and his assistant, or his crew member, I guess you'd say, who's driving the boat, goes by the nickname Papas. Everybody in the Caribbean basically has a nickname. Papas is this man's nickname. I have no idea what his given name is. I've known this guy for over 10 years. He's just Papas. Papas in Vincentian patois means porpoise. So it's, associated with the job that he does. He's out hunting porpoises for a living. And I brought this up to him one time and said, oh, you got your job, or you got your name from your job, right? And he said, what? No. He said, when I was a kid, I used to swim all the time, and so they just called me Papas. So it taught me about making assumptions. So I tell you their names just because their names are going to appear in this paragraph I read, and I want you to know who we're talking about. A solitary dorsal fin broke the water. This dolphin was our target. With a quick series of hand signals that I would later learn to interpret, Samuel silently instructed Papas to position the boat exactly as he wanted it. He readied the harpoon gun. Samuel took a few seconds to clear the area around the line coiled at his feet while the boat was bobbing on the waves, the engine idling. The dolphin was rising once every 10 seconds or so. It would take a few cycles of bobbing and breathing before the boat and the dolphin were aligned. The moment this happened, Samuel squeezed the trigger, letting fly his projectile like a comet, followed by a tail of nylon twine and surrounded by a cloud of blasted gunpowder. I was expecting a pop, but still the sound startled me. Almost instantly, there was a splash about 30 meters from the bow. The harpoon was secure. So then we started to haul the dolphin in to the side of the boat, and this is where the participant observation became very real to me, and I was compelled, I was instructed, I was commanded to put down my camera and start hauling the line. So there's a gap in the images here. The dolphin beat its tail against the boat's hull. Fearing that the harpoon might tear out, Samuel raised another harpoon above his head and drove it in for added security. The animal stopped fighting. The second harpoon had killed or gravely wounded the dolphin, and it was time to haul it on board. In a coordinated effort, the three of us put our feet against the gunwale, took hold of the rope as near to the harpoon as we could, and leaned back, pushing with our legs. The tail came up first. Samuel grabbed it as we leveraged the dolphin into the boat. I slipped and landed face to face with its lifeless, toothy grin. We'd gotten one. And in case the image is too dark for you to see, I've lightened this a bit. That facial expression means one thing only, and that's put your camera down and help us haul this dolphin. We motored back to Barely as I scooped seawater with my hands to wash my skin, my clothes, and my bag. Everything was covered in blood. I rode back to my lodgings in a crowded public van, took a long shower to try to wash the scent and memory off my skin, and went to sleep that night with conflicting feelings. I knew Samuel and his crew had provided food for their community and income for their households, but I mourned the dolphin's death. So I wasn't able to just participate in whaling and reflect on my own experiences. I had work to do. I had data to collect. One of those sets of data was spatial. I wanted to find out where these dolphins and whales were being found, in what type of marine ecosystem they were most commonly found in, depth of water, turbidity of water, distance from shore, access to food sources, and I accomplished this through mapping. As far as I know, this was the only time that Caribbean whaling has been mapped by GPS, simply because most researchers who have studied Caribbean whaling did so long ago before the advent of GPS. In doing this, I learned some very interesting things. The number one important take-home from this is the bigger whales are found in the more dangerous water. So to go after one of these pilot whales or killer whales, which are larger, they're made of more tissue which can be sold for food, and therefore they're worth more, you've got to risk more. You've got to go to the places that are rougher, more turbid water than some of the calmer places where you can find smaller dolphins. Another thing I wanted to understand was the sustainability of this catch. I had some issues regarding whaling, period. But beyond that, I wanted to find out, okay, outside of my own cultural background and my own personal and emotional affinity for these animals, are they being taken in a sustainable way, or are they being overexploited? The way to find out that was to dive deep into the records. And this is the records. This is what it looks like. These are handwritten record books that Samuel keeps. If you can make out more than 3 or 4 words of that, I want you as my research assistant. Because this is what you have to go through to get the records from Caribbean whaling. This is as good as it gets. After deciphering this, that's 1 month's worth, you can come up with something like this. And this is the record for Caribbean whaling going back to the middle of the 20th century. This is as much as we have. The gaps represent lost data, but you can kind of interpolate across those gaps to see that something was going on during the late 90s to early 2000s that caused an increase, possibly to offset the decrease in the mid to late 1980s. What's happening now? Maybe another decrease. It's kind of hard to say. But if you're trying to estimate sustainability, what you're interested in is catch versus effort. Right? Does it take more effort to maintain the same catch, or are catch and effort relatively constant when proportioned to each other? And what I found in analyzing this is the latter, that given the change in effort, right, more boats, fewer boats coming on board, catch remains relatively the same. This partially put me at ease with my sustainability question. Of course, it's not the final answer. We don't have population estimates. We don't have DNA analysis to tell about genetic diversity. We don't know how many animals are harpooned and then lost, that is, not taken ashore and then counted in this book. But we have at least a hint that sustainability is being achieved. Here's what happens after the whales are caught, and I must warn you now that some of these images are going to be intense. These are animals being butchered for food. If you are a meat eater, this is close to home. This is what happens on your behalf. Maybe not with dolphins, but with something. So if you must look away, you may, of course. But if you eat meat, I would encourage you to try to take this in. You're a part of this. These dolphins are being butchered on the dock. These children who are helping are, I guess, an average of about 12 years old, based on how many I talked to. Think about what you were doing at 12 years old. I don't remember everything I did at that age, but I guarantee you it was nothing like this. This is a very different life than many of us grew up living. After the carcasses have been gutted or dressed, they're brought to this makeshift processing station on the beach, where tissue is cut into different categories. You've got lean muscle tissue on this table, which is being processed for meat. You've got fatty tissue here, blubber, which is being prepared into kind of a cracklins type snack. It's boiled in its own oil and turned into kind of a fried fat tissue. This is the meat being prepared. It's hung in the sun to dry. If you're a fan of beef jerky or some other kind of dried meat, this is about the same consistency as that. This is the blubber being fried in its own oil. That's a cut-off oil drum that it's fried in. And in the background, you can see some of the fried oil. The darker brown tissue has been fried. When it goes to the marketplace, this is what it looks like. You've got a bundle of whale jerky tied up with a banana leaf wrap, and you've got a bag of whale blubber soaked in its own oil. And these are very popular foods in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I interviewed a little over 200 subjects on their frequency of consumption, and this is what I found. I separate it by gender, mostly because of the oil consumption, because it's so dichotomous in its usage by gender. But you can see that an average of roughly once every 2 weeks is how often people consume the whale meat. The blubber, a little bit more for men, a little bit less for women, and then the oil, significantly more, several times per week for women. This is due to the fact that oil is used as a health and beauty supplement. Women take it orally as kind of a cleanser and apply it externally to their hair and skin as sort of a moisturizer. Men typically don't do that. Men use oil only occasionally throughout the year. When they're not feeling well, they'll take a spoonful of it as kind of a medicine. When I saw this graph, though, after I compiled the data and put it through the Excel formula to create this graph, I started to get worried. The reason I got worried is because for the previous 3 years, I had been working in a country in Northern Europe called the Faroe Islands, where another whaling operation existed. That whaling operation, though, was under a lot of heavy scrutiny from 2 different sources. One source was what you would expect, the environmentalist organizations that were protesting against whaling in the Faroe Islands. We'll talk about that in a moment. The reason I was so concerned, though, when I saw the consumption data laid out for me visually like that, was because the other source of contention in Faroe Islands whaling has to do with the contaminants that are found in the whale's tissue. For the past 40 years, scientists in the Faroe Islands have been taking tissue samples from the whales and dolphins that are caught there and testing them for contamination. They've found such high concentrations of mercury and other contaminants that the official recommendation from Faroese health authorities is don't eat it. It's similar to the recommendation from the US government about smoking. The government doesn't tell us, here's how many cigarettes we suggest you smoke per month. They just say don't do it. Now, of course, it's still legal if you're 18 to smoke cigarettes. Same is true with whale consumption in the Faroe Islands. It's legal, it still happens, but the government officially recommends against it completely. They consume less whale meat in the Faroe Islands than I found they consume in St. Vincent. That made me worried. If you know anything at all about the Faroe Islands, it's probably from news images like this. This is a screen grab from CNN just a few months ago. Whaling in the Faroe Islands is very different from whaling in the Caribbean. Rather than going out to sea far from shore with a harpoon and taking 1 or 2 or 6 individual whales and bringing them back, the Faroese send out 12 or 20 or 50 boats to surround an entire pod of whales, and they drive them into the shore. When you kill that many whales at once, the average per event is somewhere between 100 and 200. When you kill that many whales at once, the entire bay turns red with their spilled blood. This is a map of the Faroe Islands. It's 18 small islands, all kind of clustered together. I referred to it as a semi-independent country earlier. The Faroe Islands are to Denmark sort of how the Virgin Islands are to the US. So it's a territory, but given some autonomy. I want to read a section here on Faroese whaling and show you some of these images. So I'll give you the background here that the village where this particular event took place was called Chutnavik. It is towards the top of the largest island in the map there, so if you can find it, it starts with a TJ. I know it sounds like it starts with a CH, but that's just Faroese. Okay. As the boats approached, we heard hands slapping hulls, wrenches and other tools tapping rails, and low staccato shouts in Faroese. We watched passengers riding forward in boats toss stones into the water, aiming just behind the whale's flukes. All of this was intended to keep the whales moving forward. The pod dispersed itself as much as possible within the confined area in which it found itself. Chutnavik's beach is framed by rocky cliffs on both sides. Some whales turned sharply to the left or right in an effort to avoid beaching and raked their bellies against the sharp undersea rocks. A vested man gave a signal, and with a shout, whalers on the beach ran into the surf. Most were part of 2-person teams carrying large metal hooks tied to long, thick ropes. When the first man reached the first stranded whale, he raised the hook and drove it down into the blowhole. Immediately, 6 or 7 other men, chest deep in the cold sea, took hold of his rope and began hauling the whale, still very much alive and fighting the whole way towards the beach. When the whale's head rested on the sand, a man withdrew a knife from a wooden sheath tied around his waist and sawed into its flesh. The blood came immediately. Great spurts, truly thicker than water, erupted as the whale went into its final spasm, the knife having just severed its spinal cord. The process was both quick and complex. The whale thrashed its fluke and arched its back high above the man's head, revealing its massive size. Its blood soon mingled with the blood of other whales, simultaneously being killed. The seawater turned red. As each whale died, men hauled its carcass further onto the beach and then turned, dispersed, and joined other teams hauling or killing whales. The process was methodical, and after the whalers' initial shouts as they entered the cold water, quieter than I would have expected. So I had a group of students with me in this case, and we didn't know this was going to happen. We were doing a study tour through the Faroe Islands. They never announce when whaling will take place. In fact, they don't know when whaling will take place. It's just by chance when the whales happen to be spotted close to shore, and we just happened to be in the right place or the wrong place at the right time to witness this. It was something that I had seen many times in my research, but having students along with me who were all seeing it for the first time really gave me a chance to see this through fresh eyes. We stayed to watch the outcome of this event and the butchering process, and this is what it was like. The entire village descended on the beach after the whales had been killed. Even people who had not participated in the killing showed up to take part in the butchering. This is kind of a, it's like the opposite of a BYOB. It's like a get your own whale situation. You come down to the beach, the person in charge gives you an allotment, a certain amount that you're allowed to harvest yourself, and you go with your knife and your rubber bucket and you cut the meat and blubber that you've been allotted. You stack it on the beach, wait until all of it's collected, take it home and put it in one of these little buildings that most Faroese houses have behind their house. This is a drying shed. Those slats on the walls have gaps between them for the salty North Atlantic air to blow through. This is what the meat looks like, very similar to the Vincentian dried whale meat, and this is what the entire meal looks like. You've got some codfish. Let's see if I can point here. Is that working? Yeah. You've got some dried codfish here in the foreground. You've got whale blubber, the white stuff here on the side, the black whale meat, and then it wouldn't be a Faroese meal if it weren't served with potatoes, so you've got some potatoes here on the side. I mentioned the issue of contaminants. This meal that you see in front of you has been called by some Faroese scientists the contested meal. It is something that is controversial in the Faroe Islands, not because it involves whales. Right? The reason that there might be controversy about this meal when discussed here in the United States has to do with the issue of whaling. In the Faroe Islands, it's a very different controversy. It's the fact that this meal, if eaten repetitively, can potentially kill you. There is so much contamination in the blubber and in the meat, different forms of contamination in the different tissues, that the government has decided there's really no safe level that can be consumed. This is what they found when they first started their research. 1978 was their first publication on the findings of the contaminant research. Mercury is usually measured in 2 different ways. You first measure the total mercury, that's just all the mercury in a tissue, and then you speciate out the methyl mercury. That's a particular kind of mercury, which is especially harmful to humans. Okay, so this is normally the way that mercury data are presented, total and methyl. So you've got total at about 1.5 parts per million, that's the unit being used, and you've got methyl at about 3/4 of a part per million. The WHO, the World Health Organization, says that 1 part per million of methyl mercury is the limit. Right? Don't eat it if it's more than that. And you can see that in 1978, the methyl mercury content was getting pretty close to that World Health Organization limit. Actually, at the time, the limit was lower. The limit has been raised. It's become more permissive in the 40 years since this was first established. But it's about 3/4 of a part per million. That's almost there to the limit that today the WHO says is too much. In 1978, that was already too much for the Faroese to be comfortable with. They embarked on a public awareness campaign both within the Faroe Islands to inform local people about the dangers of consumption, and outside of the Faroe Islands to inform people about the effects of their pollution. Mercury is introduced into the natural environment through a number of ways, some natural, some anthropogenic. On the anthropogenic side, on the human-caused side, the main way that we put mercury into the environment is through coal-fired power plants. The Faroe Islands have none. They don't burn coal. So part of their message to the rest of the world was, you are poisoning our food supply. We want you to stop. It became an environmentalist message. But who was making this environmentalist message? Whalers. That's a bit ironic, to be told that you, as a consumer of coal-generated energy, are damaging the environment by a person who is actively going out and killing whales in the ocean. Ironic, but also true, right? It's hard to dispute the facts that they're actually using. In addition to this public awareness campaign, the Faroese continued monitoring the consumption or the concentration levels of the tissue that they were taking at these whaling events. The concentrations continued to increase year by year until 2008. This is a 2012 English translation of a 2008 statement. In 2008, the numbers reached such a high level, higher than the WHO recommendation, that the Faroese government came out and said, no more. This is the translation of their statement. Don't consume it anymore. I wondered what was going on in the Caribbean. I knew that the mercury levels must be high. I mean, one thing we learn in environmental geography is that it's all connected, right? If there's mercury being put into the atmosphere, getting into the currents, it's going around the world. I wondered how bad it was in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I started collecting tissue, and I took students with me down to the Caribbean to get tissue samples from these whales, bring them back to my lab in Swanee, and do the mercury analysis. In addition to this, I sent students out into the villages to find out how much of this meat people were consuming. My previous study had only looked at a small wedge of the population, 200 or so people from the ages of 15 to 30. I wanted to get a wide range of people through all the villages. We interviewed over 900 people, aged from 18 up to something in the 90s. We got a lot of data. We also asked people about their feelings. What do you think about this food? Is it a guilty pleasure? Do you know that it's harmful and you eat it anyway? Or is it something that you eat because you feel that it's healthy? And these are the troubling results that we got. People think that it's a healthy food. Most people in America who do something unhealthy, like eat a lot of fast food or smoke cigarettes, probably do so knowing that it's not the best idea for their own personal health. They have rationalization about why they do it anyway. Not so in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Most people are eating this food, which quantitatively we know is unhealthy, and thinking that it's healthy. Now, they may not just be mistaken. I apologize for the text heaviness of this slide, but it may be the case that the benefits of this food outweigh the risks. That is the conclusion that was found in a study done in the Arctic, in Arctic Canada, back in 1998. Very similar diet based on marine mammals, whales and seals, and when taken holistically, looking at the risks, looking at the benefits, looking at the alternatives, the scientists on this study came to the conclusion that it was better to keep eating the traditional foods than to give them up and try to find something as healthy or healthier in the alternatives. I wondered if maybe this was the case in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Along the way, I'm doing these mercury studies, getting numbers back from certain species, but not from others. We started with some of the smaller species of dolphins, which, given their smaller body size, you would expect them to have lower concentrations. So far, things were looking pretty good. 2014, we got back some numbers that were a little bit higher than the WHO recommends, but I was kind of leaning on this Arctic study, thinking, you know, the traditional foods are probably going to be better considering everything altogether. But then just recently, and I mean more recently than this book has been published, this is data that didn't make it into the book because it's so recent, we found the true numbers with all the species taken together. As a reminder, the Faroese first numbers that kicked off this massive campaign of public awareness and outside lobbying for people outside of the Faroe Islands to stop polluting were about 1.5 and 3/4 parts per million. The numbers we've gotten back from St. Vincent and the Grenadines last year are over 70 parts per million, over 43 in the mercury or in the methyl mercury side. Remember, the WHO says that 1 part per million is too high for consumption. This is what the people in St. Vincent and the Grenadines are consuming. When I saw these numbers, my research immediately shifted from environmental sustainability to public health. I have developed research relationships with epidemiologists based both in the US and in the Caribbean, and we are working together with the Ministry of Health in St. Vincent. My previous contacts had all been at the Ministry of Fisheries to spread the word in a much more rapid response method than was done in the Faroe Islands. In the Faroe Islands, it took 40 years to go from maybe there's a problem to the government saying there's no safe amount to eat. I don't want to think about what would happen if we took 40 years to get the word out in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Eventually, I'm going to have to hand over the public health side of this research to my colleagues that are trained in that field. I'm a geographer. This is not what I do. There are some questions, though, that geography is particularly equipped to answer, and that has to do with the pathways that this mercury is taking. Just like the Faroe Islands, St. Vincent and the Grenadines burns no coal for energy. They burn other fossil fuels, and there are issues with that, but they burn nothing that puts mercury into the environment. They don't burn coal, they don't put mercury into the air or into the water. So where's it coming from? Is it coming from our country? Is it coming from the campus of the University of Richmond? I was told today that there is still a functioning coal-fired power plant on campus. Can we back that up?
It was shut down 20 years ago. Within the last 5 years.
Good for you. Good for you. You're off the hook now. That's great. But there are plenty of other coal-fired power plants still operating. We have them in Tennessee. Part of my electricity in my house comes from coal. And because of that, I'm culpable. But why is it so concentrated in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? Why are these numbers so vastly different at these two sides of the Atlantic? I don't know for sure. I have some hypotheses that I would be happy to talk with you about. But this is a question for geographers, for oceanographers, for atmospheric scientists, right? For our people. This is what we do. If we can find this out, it's not going to cut off the input of mercury into the system, but it might tell us something about culpability. It might tell us something about justice. And if the Vincentian people have to give up eating whale, maybe that's a good thing in some ways, maybe it's a bad thing in others. But maybe there need to be some reparations coming from somewhere else to offset the cost of whatever the alternative is going to be. If that alternative can be selected in a way that chooses something healthy, culturally fitting, and sustainable, and if there can be some funding from some of these culpable countries, then I think a proper response to this issue will have been found. And it's going to take a lot of effort from geographers, policymakers, economists, and probably a whole suite of other disciplines to make this happen. It's not going to be my generation of researchers that does this. It's almost certainly going to be yours. I don't want it to take 40 years, but it's probably not going to take 2 years. It'll be somewhere in between, and it'll be somebody of the generation that makes up most of this audience that probably solves this problem. So good luck. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dustin. So we have time for questions. The audience, if people have questions, I'm going to ask them. There's one in the back.
Yes, sir.
Are you finding plastics in these animals?
Thank you. Yeah, the question, and I'm going to repeat all the questions just to make sure everybody hears. The question was whether we're finding plastics in the animals. The answer is yes. Mercury was the first substance that I was concerned about, but there are plenty of others, and microplastics in particular are one of them. I've sent samples up to a lab in Maine that specializes in microplastic research, and the data have come back that yes, there are microplastics. We're still going through the data to find out exactly how much on average, but they do exist in the tissue. And they're almost certainly working their way up the food chain into the whales. Yes?
I know you said you're not sitting with public health side, but have the health effects from the mercury consumption in the Faroe Islands increased since the government has made an official announcement that it was no longer acceptable to eat whale?
So, really good question. She asked if the health effects, the health problems in the Faroe Islands have gotten better since the government came out with its recommendation. That's a hard question. That's a good question, but a hard one to answer for a couple of reasons. One, it's been 10 years. That's enough time to measure some effects, but it hasn't just been a straight line of a decrease in consumption. So I did a survey in 2009, the year after that recommendation came out in Faroese, saying stop eating it. And I did detect a decrease in consumption by about 20%. So that's not insignificant. For 1 year, I think that's pretty good. However, in 2010, there was a major environmentalist action campaign in the Faroe Islands from abroad against whaling. Stop whaling, an active campaign. And the response to that has been an increase in consumption. Now, why would there be an increase in consumption? I'll ask you. Why would there be an increase in consumption when people are coming from abroad telling you to stop eating whale meat? I mean, what if I came to your house and told you to stop eating whatever is your favorite food? You don't know me. I mean, you're gonna do it more because someone's telling you not to, right? I mean, I've got a 4-year-old. If I want him to get in bed, what I tell him is don't get in bed. That's what happened. As far as we can explain, that's what happened in the Faroe Islands. There was this pushback to the environmentalist campaign, which unfortunately for Faroese health resulted in higher levels of consumption. So to track health effects, you kind of need a straight line in consumption levels. Otherwise, you would expect the health effects to go up and down. And that is what I would expect to see. Now, the other complicating factor is that the effects of mercury are long-term and chronic, usually not short-term and acute. Right? You'll have short-term acute problems if you are exposed to lots of mercury all at once. If you're taking in small concentrations over many years, you're going to have accruing effects over your lifetime. And I don't know that 10 years is necessarily enough time for that. So, yes? We'll go here. So, interesting. She's asked if I think, given the information, if the information were shared in both of these cultures, would there be a change? I do. You asked for my opinion. I do, and I have a reason for that. In the Faroe Islands, we measured a change. Before the environmentalist action campaigns started, there was a decrease. It wasn't cold turkey, it wasn't 100%, but it was 20% in 1 year. I think that's something. In St. Vincent, there has not yet been a public awareness campaign. In some ways, that weighs very heavily on me because I know this information and we haven't yet shared it with the public. The reason for that is complicated. It has to do with the peer review process, with science being confirmed before it is distributed. But I have leaked some of the information to certain people that I care a lot about, some of my good friends that I've known this whole time. And, for whatever sample size they constitute, they have reduced their consumption. But I do expect it will change, maybe not in some of the older people. Where I expect to see it first is mothers' choices of what to serve their children. And if a generation of kids grows up not eating this, it's very unlikely that the next generation will start. So I think it will end, but not immediately. Yes?
I think I missed this, but how much of the diet is whale consumption in most of these places? Is it like every meal, this is what we do, or is it like an occasional special ritual?
No, you didn't miss that. So the question has to do with the frequency of consumption, and I touched on that a little bit in the St. Vincent context, where it differs a bit by gender, but roughly once every 2 weeks is the time for consumption. In the Faroe Islands, it's a little bit more than that. The last government-run study showed that it was consumed, or that it constituted about 1/3 of the meat consumption. So that's significantly more, assuming that people eat meat most days. However, in both countries, there are significantly sized subgroups that abstain completely, mostly for religious purposes. So the averages get skewed because of those zero consumptions. Yes, sir.
Is whaling important to the local economies in these places you've been studying?
So the question was, what's the role of whaling in the local economies? That's really interesting. In the Faroe Islands, whaling is a source of free food, and that's dictated by law. It is forbidden, except for certain loopholes, to sell whale meat for money. When the whales are killed, everybody who participates is doing so on a volunteer basis, and everyone who receives portions is receiving those portions for free. You just have to go and harvest it yourself. You butcher the animal yourself. In St. Vincent, it's very different. The whales are caught by the Specialized Guild of Whalers. They are processed by the Specialized Guild of Processors, and then they're sold on the market like any other food source and their food product would be sold. I don't want to draw too firm of a distinction between those, though, because even a free food source has economic value, right? If it were to go away, you'd have to buy something or find some other free food source. So yes, they both play an economic role, and I think the size of that role is pretty closely tied to the consumption rate that we talked about. So it's a significant source of food. It's not a once a year holiday food, but it's also not a daily staple. It's somewhere in between that. Yes, ma'am.
You have a
Sorry.
with whale catches, and in 2009 the number was insanely high. I was wondering if you knew, it was double every other year.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there were reasons for that.
So the question was about this graph. Let me give you the disclaimer that...
Well, or with the data.
No, well, there's even a better disclaimer, or worse, I guess. The main whaler there, Samuel, the one I speak about or write about, he disputes this number. Now, this number is taken from his record books, right, which I've had my students transcribe. And because he disputed this year, I went back and checked to make sure that there wasn't some misreading of the handwriting, which could have been possible, right, given the handwriting. I am as confident about this year as I am any other year on this graph. Now, I do use an extrapolation formula to get from Samuel's records to the entire catch for the country, because Samuel is the only whaler that keeps records. Everybody else brings in whales, and the very next day forgets how many whales they had, never writes it down. So because of Samuel's recorded catch, being the only one in the country, I do have to do some estimation to get to this. However, I use the same formula to get 2009's data as I did every other year, so I am as confident there as I am anywhere else. The root of your question, though, was what explains this. I wish I knew. Could it be biogeographical? Maybe. Maybe there were just more whales and dolphins in the waters then. Could it be economic? Maybe. Maybe Samuel needed to put a down payment on a house and needed some more money. I honestly don't know. I was there that year, so I witnessed, I'd say, about a quarter of these whales being killed, and yet I never detected any sort of special desire or special effort being made. So aside from some hypotheses, I really can't say. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to ask that the Faroe Islands obviously is a non-discriminatory kill. Down in the Caribbean and their harpooning, do they discriminate if they see a mother calf? Are they not harpooning that one versus another one?
Yeah, so she's asking about the choices being made by the harpooners in the Caribbean as to whether to go for whales, males or females, or young or adult. Typically, the larger males are what's going to bring in the most income. So that's the first target. That said, a small whale is better than no whale. It costs very little to go ahead and thrust the harpoon once you're already out at sea. The largest expenditure by far is gas for the boat. So if you've already made it out that far and you're not seeing anything else except smaller animals, you'll go ahead and take the smaller animals. There are absolutely no regulations about what you can or cannot take. That has to do with size of animal, sex of animal, species of animal, with only a few exceptions, and that has to do with international regulation. There are no Vincentian laws saying this whale or that whale is off limits. So the whalers do have some agency and some choice as to which individuals they take, but are very quick to compromise on that when the catch has been slim. And of course that has a conservation effect, right? I mean, if you're taking females, especially nursing females, or if you're taking the young, you are having a larger impact on that population than if you're taking older males. And that could be a piece of information that goes into future policy. I'm very pleased that the Ministry of Fisheries has been consulting me and some of the other scientists that are working with me on this in the crafting of their policy. They haven't passed any policy yet, but they've at least been talking with us so that their policy is science-informed. And to be honest, that's better than we can say for a lot of policy. So I am hopeful that in the future, both public opinion and public policy will be steered by science.
Maybe one last question. I thought I saw a hand in the back row. Was it your hand and stuff? Or?
I saw this young lady had a question.
Okay.
So wait, I'm not sure if I understand this. Is the public health plan with policy, the cabinet already in the works, or is that the next step?
So her question was about the timeline of public health awareness in St. Vincent. It's in the works. I don't know how much experience any of you have working in the Caribbean, but things go slowly there. And, you know, I've been working in the Caribbean long enough to not expect quick turnarounds. It's more about the direction than the speed. And I'm pleased in the direction that things are going. So I told you that I shifted from working with the Ministry of Fisheries to the Ministry of Health recently when the Mercury stuff came up. Here's what I thought was going to happen. I thought I'd walk into the Ministry of Fisheries and say, look, there's a lot of mercury. I'm going to go start talking to the people in Ministry of Health. And I thought they were going to say, no, you can't do that. Whaling is such a vital part of our fisheries economy. You can't do anything to shut it down. Instead, what they said was, this looks really bad. Yes, by all means, go talk to the people in the Ministry of Health. Great. Got over to Ministry of Health. I thought what they were going to say when they saw the mercury data was, this is terrible. We've got to stop. Nobody should ever eat another whale in this country again. And that would have had disastrous effects on the economy and the personal livelihoods of these people that had really taken me under their wing in my pursuit of this data. They didn't say that. They said, but whaling is such a vital part of our culture and economy. So it was like they were both speaking each other's language. To me, that shows that there can be dialogue. That when these two ministries, which have very different mandates to each other, are both faced with the same problem, that they'll be able to work together. So that encourages me. Yeah, it's going to be slow. And that's why I said it's probably going to be your generation of scientists, not mine, that sees an end to this. But at least it's moving that way. It's moving in the right direction. So, thanks.
Let's thank Dr. Phil.